Welcome, everyone. And I hope you had a great workshop, a great Politicologenetmaal. I think for the non-Dutch speakers, that is a very inconvenient kind of conference title. But it literally means 24 hours of political science. In Dutch, we have this nice word, etmaal, which means 24 hours. So so basically, usually the conference runs from 12 to 12. You go to a city, for instance, Nijmegen, where the Radboud University is, and you come at 12, have a lunch, do the workshops, and a dinner, a keynote, and then another morning of workshops and a lunch, and you go home. Unfortunately, this year things are slightly different. We have a pandemic going on, and I think I'm still very, very happy that we still did it this year. We had 11 amazing workshops, over 100 participants, in all sorts of topics, ranging from local Dutch and Flemish politics to realism in IR, comparative politics, political communication. Very interesting topics and great papers. So thanks so much for being there, and also showing kind of the resilience of our political science community, because it's particularly tempting in times like these to not engage, and I think it's great that we do, for ourselves, to keep the discussion going, but also especially for the more junior colleagues who really they really need these kind of things, even if they're online. um, what we'll do today, oh yeah, just one more thing. I wanted to thank my colleague here, Andrei Zaslav, who co-organized this workshop with me. And we had tremendous help from Amy Verdun from the Dutch Political Science Association, and Peter van Aalst from the Flemish Political Science Association. So thank you very much. What we'll do this afternoon, because usually I said, right, at 12 we will close, but we decided it's probably best to do this in the afternoon on Friday rather than on Thursday evening. People are not very keen on something like this, so I'm very glad we found this moment. So what we'll do, we'll have a great keynote by Professor Anand Menon, followed by an award ceremony for the Daniel Heinsius Master Thesis Prize and the Els de Witte PhD Prize. Yes, so before we start, I'd like to welcome Anand once more. Anand Menon is a professor of European politics at King's College, London. He's director of the think tank, I think I can say, UK in a Changing Europe. He has tremendous experience on European politics, and especially now, obviously, lots of hands-on experience in the Brexit case. He's been special advisor to the House of Lords EU committee, and I think we couldn't ask for anyone better place to talk us and update us perhaps a little bit on well, what is going on with Brexit. How are we how we're doing today, and how the relations between the UK and Europe are changing and evolving now. After the presentation, Amy Verdun will be our discussant, and we'll ask a few questions, but you can also ask your questions and in two ways. Sorry, I saw that the link was wrong there, but what you can do is you can ask your question by raising your hand or by typing it in the Q&A, and then I'll say it for you. So without much further ado, I will like to give the floor to Anand, and you can share your slides and start your presentation.
Thanks, Moritz, and hi, everyone. It's a real shame we couldn't be together. Actually, this is the year when it finally becomes clear to everyone that the best part of conferences is, in fact, the dinner, which is the one part, of course, that we can no longer do. I'm going to talk briefly about what's going on with Brexit. I mean, I know the title says what's happened. I'm going to leave that out, but if you have questions about anything that's happened over the last 5 years, I'm very, very happy to take them. Also, I'm very, very happy, as Moritz said, I'm essentially not an academic anymore because of running the UK in a changing Europe. But if you've got any questions just about how to navigate that rather treacherous interface between universities, politics, civil service, and indeed public sort of debate, I'm happy to talk about that too. So what I'm going to do today basically is talk about two things. I'm going to talk about what the economics of Brexit now looks like. And then I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the politics and what the politics is and how the politics might develop into the future. So I'll speak for about 20 minutes, I think, and thereafter happy to take your questions. So on the economics, we can say several things. The first thing is there have been some attempts already to model what the impact of Brexit has been to date. Now, this is a treacherous undertaking, particularly treacherous at the moment because of COVID. But what John Springford from the Centre for European Reform did over a period of several years, and I've just done the first few months of his study there. I mean, he's actually just about 2 weeks ago released new numbers, is they basically took a basket of economies that historically have performed a bit like the UK economy, or very similarly to the UK economy, if you look at the two lines, and extrapolated forward from June 2016 to see what happened with that basket of economies and what happened to the United Kingdom. And to cut a long, messy story short, their finding has been that since the vote to leave the European Union, the UK economy is somewhere in the order of 3 to 4% smaller if you update these figures to now to right to the end of the transition period, 3 to 4% smaller than it would have been had the UK not voted to leave the European Union. And this is without any of the direct economic impacts of Brexit. This is while the UK was still within the single market and the customs union. And the two reasons they basically broadly come up with is one, adaptation, that is to say, firms that trade with the UK have been looking to either find new markets or source new places within the single market and the customs union from which to purchase the things they need to avoid any potential disruption from Brexit. And secondly, there's been a fall off of investment in the United Kingdom, not surprisingly, in the sense that companies wanted to wait and see what Brexit looked like before they made investment decisions. So Brexit has already started to impact on the UK economy. I mean, one of the paradoxical implications of that is that the actual impact of leaving the single market and the customs union is slightly cushioned by the fact that some of those impacts have already been felt. But looking ahead, we did some work with colleagues at the LSE and tried to model what the future might hold. And if you look, the numbers on the left are the ones you should be looking at. They are the modelled impacts of the deal that, I apologise for my camera keeping on doing that. I have no idea how to, let me see if I can start it again. I think we're going to have to do without camera. My camera seems to have totally and utterly frozen at the moment. So just bear with me and look at the slides and I'll try and bring it back later on. The figures on the left are the important ones to look at. The figures on the left are the impact of Boris Johnson's deal. The figures on the right are the additional hit to the economy that there would have been in the event that there had been a no-deal Brexit. So the numbers are huge, 30-odd% drop in trade and a 6% per capita hit over this 10-year period. So over 10 years, the impact of Brexit would be, roughly speaking, about 6 or 7% of GDP is what the numbers came up with. And to put that into some sort of context, it's worth thinking that if you look at the orange line on this graph, that is the forecast impact of the pandemic on the UK economy. And the contrast with Brexit over this 15 to 20 year period is quite striking. We would expect the impact of Brexit to be 2 to 3 times greater over that time period than the impact of the pandemic. What is, of course, interesting, and I'll talk to this a little bit later on as well, is because the short-term impact of the pandemic has been so severe, it has tended to drown out some of the impacts of Brexit. It is virtually impossible at the moment to disentangle COVID and Brexit impacts on the UK economy. The other thing worth saying about the economics of the moment is that we still don't have Brexit and a full-fat version, by which I mean that although the European Union has imposed the full gamut of checks on on exports from the United Kingdom, the UK government has not as yet imposed any checks on goods coming from the European Union. So one of the paradoxes of Brexit at the moment is if you're an EU exporter, you're having a great time because you're exporting to Britain essentially as you used to do. If you're a UK exporter, you're already getting stung by the checks. And the economic impacts will increase as the UK government gradually phases in those checks. I should say that one of the reasons why those checks haven't been brought in yet is because the UK government was very, very sensitive to the prospect of shortages or price rises in the shops hitting consumers, because that would have had an immediate impact, I think, on public opinion, exactly in the way that the workings of the Northern Ireland Protocol, which has led to some shortages in supermarkets in Northern Ireland, has led to a shift in public opinion there. It's worth just pausing. I imagine there are many students of European integration here, and this will underline all the things we learned when we were students learning about the single market, that the costs of Brexit are primarily the costs of non-tariff barriers. This slide is a slide from a leaked government forecast from 2017. The diagonal blue lines underneath the lines are the non-tariff barrier costs that would be imposed by leaving the single market. They are, as you will see, significantly bigger than the costs of tariffs. So yes, the British government likes to talk about having secured a tariff-free deal, but that tariff-free deal doesn't deal with most of the impact economically that we expected Brexit to have. A further thing worth bearing in mind, just to give you a sense of sort of relative proportion, is if you look above the 0% line, there are two elements there. The first are the potential benefits of regulatory flexibility. That is to say, what government economists thought could be achieved by the fact of the UK not being tied to EU regulations. And the second element of the bit above the line, it is the blue bit above the line, is the forecast economic benefits of the UK signing trade deals with every single one of those countries under the graph. So if we were to sign trade deals with the US, with Australia, New Zealand, Malaysia, Brunei, China, India, etc., that is the scale of benefit we could expect to see from it. In other words, there might be reasons for trying to sign trade deals with lots of countries. Making up for the impact of Brexit on the UK economy is simply not one of them, because the difference in scale, because as you all know, this is down to geography, we do not trade as much with countries that are far away, however big their economies might be, as we do with the European Union. Now, for me as a political scientist, one fascinating question that comes out of this is, does it matter? Does this economics matter? Does the disruption matter? Does the sort of 7% hit to GDP over 10 years, which is huge by any measure, does that play out in the politics? And there are good reasons to believe that it doesn't. I mean, for me, one of the defining features of the Brexit debate was it represented a triumph of politics over economics. And what we see here is an ever-increasing proportion of the British people felt that Brexit would make the economy worse off rather than better off. So even a number of Leave supporters came to think that the overall economic impact of Brexit would be negative. However, if you look at this graph, which is the YouGov tracker, where they asked the question, was it the right or wrong decision to vote to leave the EU? Yes, we've seen a majority since about the second half of 2017 who think it's wrong, but it's very, very close indeed. And I'll deal with this bit in 2021 in a minute. The fact of the matter is, for all the expected economic damage that Brexit might do in the short to medium term, very, very few British people have changed their minds about Brexit. If you look at this diagram and you want to know why it is that we are now getting a majority thinking it's wrong, that is largely because of demographic churn. It is largely because a number of people who were too young to vote in 2016 and so weren't included in the polling have subsequently reach the age of 18, and the massive majority of young people tend to be Remainers. And of course, at the same time, not a lot, but a significant number of Leave voters have died. So this demographic change is what's responsible for this, rather than the fact that Leavers have suddenly decided they were wrong to vote for Leave. Now, the politics of Brexit are fascinating, and the most easy way of showing that is via this, that there is a very, very strong correlation between your social values, whether you're social liberal or social conservative, and how you voted in the Brexit referendum. Actually, while I'm here, I'm going to do a bit of PR work for some colleagues. the book, which I'll show you when my camera's back on, by Maria Sobolewska and Rob Ford, that's called Brexit Land, is the best single book to explain this phenomenon. But what Brexit did was it triggered this values divide between British people, and it meant that British people then were divided by values as much, if not more than, by the traditional left-right divide of our politics. If you look at this, very, very high numbers of British people now still think that they have strong Brexit identities. If you think back to the elections that were held in the UK in May, what you found was that the Conservatives made gains disproportionately in areas where there was strong support for leave. So in other words, we have a new political cleavage now that competes with the traditional class-based left-right cleavage that always used to structure British politics. The values cleavage is also now a fundamental factor in determining vote choice. And so you see that in, for instance, the fall of the famous red wall seats to the Conservative Party. These are seats that in many cases either never or never since the 20s or 30s had Conservative MPs, but it was the triggering of this social values cleavage that played a large part in the change. I said I'd mention the end of that YouGov graph again when you see support for Brexit go up, and if you look here, this is the reason. You have seen some degree of movement from people who regret Brexit to people who think Brexit is a good idea, because of the impact of the UK's successful vaccine rollout. And a staggering 49% of people who voted Remain in 2016 have come to the conclusion that Brexit meant we were able to have a successful vaccine rollout program. I should stress this is utter nonsense. There is no relationship between Brexit and the vaccine rollout program. In fact, the big decisions about the vaccine rollout program were taken while the UK was still in the transition period and so bound by EU law. But as is so often the case in politics, the truth is actually largely irrelevant. Perception is king, and the perception in this country, the very strong perception, is Brexit has helped us with the vaccine rollout, and that of course has helped strengthen the position of the Conservative Party. Looking forward, however, there are a whole host of unknowns. I mean, this is a slightly messy graph, but what this graph represents is some polling we did with MPs, with party members, with party activists, so councillors and candidates, and with voters. And we've tried to segment the voters a little bit. So here is perhaps the key vote that we should be thinking about in terms of British politics at the moment. These are people who in the December 2019 election decided to switch their votes from Labour direct to the Conservatives. And what we did is we plotted these voters along two axes. This is the traditional left-right axis, economic values, if you like, whereas this is social values. And what you will see from this is on social values, the Conservatives are relatively coherent as a bloc. There's relatively little spacing north to south amongst Conservatives, and they find themselves relatively close to voters. The Labour Party, on the other hand, is massively more social liberal, both than the Conservative Party and to the voters, and particularly those Labour to Tory switches from 2019. When you talk about economic policy, however, the situation is reversed. Labour is very close to voters and rather homogenous internally on economic issues. The Conservatives are miles away. Tory MPs are far more right-wing on the economy than traditional Tory voters, and particularly those switchers. What this speaks to are several things. Firstly, the fact that in December 2019, Boris Johnson effectively created a Leave coalition to propel him into power with a majority of 80. 82% of Conservative voters at the last election were Leave supporters. But the Conservative Party is now, because it's a cross-class coalition to an extent it never was before, is extremely divided on economic policy. Voters in those traditional Labour seats who voted Conservative are in favour of a large state, of generous welfare payments. They're in favour of greater investment. They're in favour of greater state borrowing. They're not fans of low taxation if it means less state investment. Traditional Conservative voters, of course, believe exactly the opposite. They want taxes down, they want state spending reined in, they don't want to see more borrowing, they're not in favour of a more generous welfare state. So key to the future of British politics is going to be the issues that dominate British politics. If you look at this at the moment, of course, the coronavirus is still dominating, Brexit is falling off, the economy is starting to edge up. The crucial period, I think, for British politics will be in the autumn of this year, when the furlough scheme, which has very, very successfully protected people against job losses, is finally wound up. If we see a massive spike in unemployment following that, it might well be that politics reasserts itself along the left-right axis and that the Brexit dimension is slightly more forgotten. But there is a reason why we have a government in the United Kingdom that likes to focus on issues like free speech in universities, like Black Lives Matters, like immigration. All those issues are key issues for a government that is very, very keen to speak to values issues. And you can be sure that this government will keep speaking to values issues throughout its tenure, because those are the areas on which it is united. However, there are difficult economic choices to be made going forward. There are going to be choices about levels of taxation, levels of borrowing, whether we should be trying to pay down the debt immediately, levels of investment. The government has made one of its key pledges the idea of levelling up the United Kingdom. That is to say, trying to deal with persistent, long-term and large-scale regional inequalities that blight the UK economy. If you look in terms of productivity, the gap between the most productive part of the UK economy and the least productive part of the UK economy is equivalent to the gap between the most and least productive parts of the Eurozone. So compared to any other European state, the regional levels of regional inequality in the UK are sky high. However, when it comes to tackling those levels of regional inequality, there will be a fight in the Conservative Party. And one of the interesting things going forward will be what Boris Johnson's parliamentary party actually looks like when they're being asked to vote on policy. We've already seen the creation of the Northern Research Group, a group of MPs committed to keeping welfare spending high, making sure investment in the North really happens. And there are other groups of Conservative MPs who are far more orthodoxly Thatcherite in their view, who want to see a small state, lower spending, lower taxes. It remains to be seen the degree to which those MPs are willing to vote against the government if it doesn't pursue policies that they agree with. And of course, you can turn this story on its head for the Labour Party. Keir Starmer needs the public to be thinking about the economy. As soon as that is the case, he is on home turf, because the Labour Party is profoundly divided on values questions. Like many continental European social democratic parties, there is a values gulf at the heart of the Labour Party between those sort of metropolitan liberal Labour voters congregated in the big cities, who tend to be very socially liberal, and traditional working class Labour heartlands where people tend to be far more socially conservative. I remember about 3 years ago, one of the things we do is we give presentations to political parties, and one week on the Tuesday I had to go to Wigan to talk to Lisa Nandy's constituency party, where people were talking about welfare payments, the lack of decent education opportunities, and also about their desire to see immigration cut. And 2 days later, I went to Primrose Hill, which is Keir Starmer's constituency party, to do the same sort of question and answer session. And in Keir Starmer's session, the only thing that people wanted to talk about was sustainability and the environment. On these issues, Labour is composed of two different tribes, and they don't want to be talking about those issues. On the economy, both parties were talking about the same thing: the need for a more activist state, the need for more generous welfare payments, and so on. So for Keir Starmer to do well, he needs to be able to attack the government on economics. And we've seen a sign of that this week. For those of you who follow British politics closely, an announcement was made on the start of this week over funding for catch-up classes for kids who've missed out on schooling during the pandemic. The amount that was announced was about a 15th of the size that most teaching unions and indeed experts had decided would be appropriate for the task at hand. Labour immediately, therefore, has something to attack the government over, and it's a policy that has been limited by the Treasury and the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, saying we cannot afford to keep spending money. How effective Keir Starmer is at using that issue will give us a lot of clues about how effective the Labour Party is going to be in the event that we face a post-pandemic recession. So in conclusion, Brexit isn't over. It's not over in at least two senses. In the sense I've spoken about now, which is that the effects of Brexit have not yet been fully felt and will play out over the next months and years. It's also worth noting Brexit isn't open because nothing is finalised yet. We haven't yet arrived at a common understanding of how the trade and cooperation should operate. There are no decisions yet taken on data adequacy or financial services equivalence. We're due to have a review of the TCA in 5 years' time, which I'm sure the Tories will try and leverage for electoral advantage. And of course, it is still far from certain whether the Northern Ireland Protocol can be made to work. I've not talked about Northern Ireland or Scotland, but I'm very happy to answer questions. And Brexit will continue to have an impact on other policy agendas, if only because of its continuing economic impact, and will continue to haunt our politics going forward. The degree to which it haunts our politics is going to be the fundamental issue that will determine who does well and who does badly in British politics for at least the rest of this Parliament, and I would guess for one more Parliament at a minimum to come. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to try and turn my camera back on, and hopefully you're all still there, because for a moment I thought I'd been disconnected and I was talking to myself.
All right, great. No, that was great. Thanks so much, Anand. We heard every word. Yes, that was very well noted. I mean, I think
actually, these are the two books. If you want to understand contemporary British politics, these are the two books you need to read.
Great, great. So that's the one by Robert Ford and Maria Sobolewska.
Yeah, and this is Richard Wynne-Jones and Ailsa Henderson on Englishness.
Great. Well, thanks for these recommendations.
If you see them, tell me they owe me a drink.
Great. Well, thanks so much for your presentation. And I think your last slide really says it all. Brexit isn't over, because that's really interesting. We invited you to come to the Politicologenetmaal in 2019. Well, Brexit was still ongoing, and we were wondering, well, by 2020 that was, is it still a hot topic today? And obviously it is. And I think, so thanks you very much for your presentation. I will give the floor to Amy, who can ask a question or two. And I invite all participants to ask your questions in the Q&A or by raising your hand. If you raise your hand, I can open your microphone. So we won't see your video, but we can open your microphone. But you can also type it in the Q&A if that's more convenient. Amy, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Maurits, and thanks very much, Anand, for your talk. I've been often asked by my students why there wasn't a second referendum. And I always say, well, it's really difficult. I always ask Anand. So I was just wondering, you didn't give that today. And it's been one of those issues where you and I have spoken about before. And in the past, you've emphasized that it was just political suicide to talk about it, but it was still constructed in a certain way, right? Because going into the referendum, it was an advisory referendum. It didn't need to be taken over by members of parliament or constructed in that way, but somehow it got in that direction. But I was just wondering if you can share that with us. It's not only an academic question. It's also something that, you know, we're now going to be the new United Kingdom, as you know, right? We already have endless numbers of academics who are fleeing from the UK to the Netherlands. English is a language that is used in many universities. Every new hire is predominantly less Dutch than the previous one in universities. So we are really very British, even though we have this terrible accent. But some of our political parties will still toy around with referendums. And so I think it's a topic that's academic, but it's also political in this country. Anyway, I was just wondering if you could speak to that from all these angles.
Well, let me start with your comment about the Dutch and the British, because I remember a former British ambassador in The Hague saying to me, one of the reasons why we screw up as Brits so continually in Europe is we tend to assume that just because the Dutch speak brilliant English, they think like us, and they don't. So, you know, British politicians turn up in The Hague and assume that Dutch politicians are every bit as cynical about the EU as they are, because they've heard that the Dutch are quite Eurosceptic, but it's a fundamentally different level. But on your question, I suppose the referendum was legally advisory, but it was politically binding. It was politically binding for several reasons. It was politically binding because David Cameron said it was. I mean, he said in terms, we will do whatever you tell us to do. And that line was used by Brexit supporters subsequent to the referendum. It is very difficult under those circumstances to make the case for another referendum, just because those who feel they've already won will feel betrayed. We were told we would only have one referendum. Now, the sort of more sort of banal reason why we didn't have a second referendum is there was never a majority in Parliament for a second referendum. However hard they tried, there simply were not the numbers for a second referendum. Whether or not there would have been the numbers for a deal whereby Parliament voted for Mrs. May's deal, and then we had a referendum on that deal, is a whole different point. But one of the complicating factors is, of course, the fact that no one was quite certain what we'd have a referendum on. Because some people wanted no deal, some people wanted Mrs. May's deal, and some people wanted Remain. Having three questions would have been very, very messy. Some people suggested having referendums on successive Thursdays. One on leave versus Remain, one on what terms we should leave on if we were to leave. But I mean, imagine what would happen to turnout between those two Thursdays, apart from anything else. So, you know, there are a lot of reasons why ultimately there was no second referendum. I think, you know, you can draw a whole load of lessons about referendums from our referendum. Firstly, you shouldn't do what a parliamentary committee called a bluff call referendum. This was a referendum called to deal with a problem. It wasn't a referendum call because the government was genuinely interested in whether the public wanted to leave or remain and was happy to do either. It was a referendum call to snuff out problems within the Conservative Party. There was no preparation whatsoever, and the Prime Minister explicitly told the civil service not to prepare for a vote to leave. So we were massively unprepared, and Vote Leave deliberately went into the referendum without a clear prospectus as to what Brexit would mean. If you like, they'd watched the experience of the Scottish referendum in 2014, because the SNP had put out a very detailed paper on Scottish independence before the referendum. And of course, they spent the whole campaign being attacked for it on the detail. The Leave campaign had seen that and they thought, okay, we won't fall into that trap. We will be blithely vague and ambiguous. So you could find Leavers who said WTO terms, you could find Leavers who said Norway, you could find Leavers that said once we've left we can continue trading exactly as we are now. No one was pinned down to a specific model, which meant that after the vote we were essentially clueless about what Brexit meant. The other thing worth saying, I mean, you know, looking at the UK during this period, it would have been very easy just to think, oh my God, these people have lost their minds. There was no stable majority for any specific outcome, either in Parliament or the country. And that's not a good place to be. So in a sense, when Parliament sort of had its agonies over Brexit in 2017, 18 and 19, it was faithfully representing the people, because the people couldn't decide either. It was a really tough place to be.
So another question that came up when I was reflecting on your comments is the phenomenon of the COVID-19 pandemic. Mm-hmm. You spoke to the point that the government has managed to frame things in such a way that it looks as if it's the result of their fantastic behavior. But as we've seen, that Brexit isn't necessarily positive for people, doesn't actually matter in terms of how they feel about things. If COVID is increasingly seen as something that the government has done well, might that also lead to a very different internal politics, regardless of what comes out of things? I was just wondering if you could maybe share a little bit more insight on that matter.
Yeah, if the government is seen to have handled COVID well in the round, absolutely. I mean, look, the chances of Boris Johnson not being Prime Minister after the next election are, it seems to me, vanishingly small. simply because of the state of the polls where we're at the moment and the fact that Labour can't seem to get its act together. But yeah, the fact of having a good pandemic certainly helped with those elections we had in early May. What we don't know is how the pandemic story will play out. So, yep, the government's riding the crest of a wave on what is, by any measure, a massively successful vaccine rollout. However, we have one of the worst death tolls in Europe. The government has made mistakes egregiously on occasion in being slow to lock down. Whether the politics of the deceased comes back, we're meant to be having an inquiry next year. So there will be things said in that question the government's ability to deal with this effectively. I'm sure there will be victims groups that are already set up that will be lobbying both for legal action, for instance, about what happened in care homes, and for memorials to be set up. That could be quite difficult for the government, the focus being back on that. So we don't know which way this will go ultimately. But yeah, absolutely. If the government manages to come out of this telling us a positive story, at the moment, you know, I can report from the United Kingdom that basically people are so utterly delighted by the fact they can go to the pub and they can go to restaurants, that they are not minded to dwell on what happened last year, and they are not minded to dwell. I mean, this applies to me as much as anyone else, that basically that's what you're thinking about. You know, we've got a restaurant reservation tonight, and actually that trumps anything at the moment, because
we should have had the restaurant reservation for you in the Netherlands and just fly you home. That would be a bit difficult. So Mavis, if I may, can I ask one more question, then I'll leave it open to the rest of the people. Okay, so my final question was about the integrity of the geography of the United Kingdom.
Mm-hmm.
And so I noticed you didn't speak too much about that. I mean, obviously, we don't have to repeat all the numbers, but, you know, the 4 parts of the United Kingdom didn't vote exactly the same way.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking a lot about identity, and that is an important part in understanding the whole Brexit situation. But as things are moving around, what's your view on either unification of Ireland or Scottish independence?
I think in both Northern Ireland and Scotland, oh, there's the camera again. In both Northern Ireland and Scotland, Brexit has shifted public opinion and public attitudes. There's no doubt about that. There are more people in favour of a unified Ireland now than was the case before 2016. There has been a more or less stable majority in Scotland for independence over the last 12 months or so. So things have shifted. I think in Ireland, it's going to be a slow process. It's going to be a slow process for all sorts of reasons. And ultimately, it will hinge on whether or not the two sides are able to find a compromise that makes the protocol work. Šefčovič has been very clear that he sees the protocol as an opportunity for Northern Ireland to have the best of both worlds. That is to say, access to the 2 markets rather than just one of them. If they can find a way of making the protocol work so that both communities are happy with it and the economy does well, then I think actually the idea of unification is on the back burner. It was always going to come up for demographic reasons at some point, but I think it might be relatively slow. If the current unrest continues, and if, for instance, the British government acts on its threat to invoke Article 16 on the protocol, anything can happen. There's a recipe for real instability, the possible return to violence. We've got marching season coming up in July. So Northern Ireland, it's a very delicate situation, but I don't think there's much appetite, not least in the Republic at the moment, to have a serious conversation about a border poll. Scotland, well, Nicola Sturgeon now says she has a mandate for a referendum. And an interesting question for political scientists, I suppose, if she doesn't have a mandate for a referendum, what the hell is the democratic path towards a referendum? You've had an election, you've won it on the prospectus of having a referendum. If the UK government turns around, as it has every legal right to do, and says no, what can the Scots do? So I suspect the UK government will say no, that there will be a standoff. There will, I would guess, depending again on how the Scottish government is judged, because, you know, the SNP is showing the first signs of being vulnerable to criticism on its record at the moment. But I would imagine in the next 5 to 7 years there will have to be a referendum. Certainly if the SNP do very well in the next general election. But here it gets interesting, because you can't just read across from the polls to Scottish independence. And what I would say is, I think Brexit has made the emotional case for Scottish independence stronger, which is why you see the polls supporting yes to independence now for the first time over a sustained period. It's made the practical case for Scottish independence slightly more difficult. And the reason is because the UK has done such a hard Brexit, if Scotland chooses to leave the UK and join the European Union, there will have to be a border between Scotland and England. So the same conversation we've had about Northern Ireland we'll have to have about Scotland. I'm not convinced the Scots would vote for that. We don't know. I mean, no one knows how that referendum would go. The other thing, of course, is we'll have a very similar debate to the Brexit referendum over economic costs. There was a very good report done by Thomas Sampson at the LSE about, I'm losing all track of time in lockdown, about 3 months ago, I think, on the costs of Scottish independence, where they were saying that the costs of independence will be 3 times the cost of Brexit. And interestingly enough, they also said joining the European Union would have a net 0 impact on the Scottish economy because any gains that will be made from trade with the European Union would be entirely offset by losses necessitated by the border between England and Scotland. So there's a long way to go.
All right, great. So just as a reminder to everyone, you can ask your questions by typing them in the Q&A module below your screen or by raising your hand. Meanwhile, we had a question from my colleague here at Radboud University, Nijmegen, Gijs-Jan Brandsma. I'm just going to open your mic and you should be able to talk. And we should be able to hear you.
Yes, and I think I'm now unmuted, but I'm not sure whether you can see me or not. But anyway, thanks very much.
We can't see you, but we hear you very well.
Wonderful. Oh, it was good seeing you again, Anand. Also, thank you very much for sharing all these insights with us on the backgrounds and the possible effects of Brexit. I had 2 questions, really. One relates to the economic impact of Brexit and how that is perceived by Leave voters. And I think the figures that you showed very clearly that Leave voters didn't really seem to care that much about a loss in GDP for the British economy. But what I wanted to ask you about that really is not necessarily the GDP itself, but could it have something to do maybe with the expected distribution of GDP and the effects thereof? Because of course GDP is about the entire British economy. Maybe people in, let's say, the old industrial north have this idea that if we have Brexit, some city boys will leave London, which of course will result in a lowering of the GDP because there are large corporations. But maybe some small, medium-sized enterprises might flourish again in the north, somewhere in the Midlands. What is your take on that? Do we see any evidence on any differentiated impact already or forecasted differentiated impact in GDP in various economic sectors? And I'll just wait with my second question for later. Yeah.
Well, let me start with 2 stories about that. Firstly, I remember during the referendum campaign, George Osborne, the Chancellor, made a speech in which he said, if we vote to leave the European Union, the City of London will be damaged and house prices will fall. And I remember getting a text from a friend of mine from the town I grew up in, is in West Yorkshire, saying, has George Osborne swapped sides in this referendum? Because basically for many people in the country, the City of London getting damaged and house prices falling are good outcomes. So yes, there was partly this issue about GDP. The other story I would tell is about a week before the referendum, I did a Q&A session in a pub in Newcastle. And pre-referendum Britain was an amazing place because, you know, this was a midweek in a pub in Newcastle and 500 people bought tickets and didn't buy tickets. They signed up and turned up in this pub to do a Q&A on Brexit. About halfway through, this guy said to me, what will the economic impact of Brexit be? And I started talking about the forecast, and I said, so on balance, you know, there will be a negative impact on GDP because of leaving the single market and the customs union, if that's what we decide to do. And this woman stood up and shouted at me, that's your bloody GDP, not mine. Right?
Yeah.
And that speaks to exactly what you said, is that, you know, for many people in many parts of the country, GDP didn't reflect their own lived experience. Like any other country, there are engines of economic growth here, and if they do well, GDP works well. but that can mean that large swathes of the country still aren't doing well and no one notices and the government gets away with saying this is a success. So there's an element of that. I think there are several different leave attitudes to the economy. One is we simply don't believe you. Okay, you're talking rubbish. There won't be any economic impact. Get over yourself. The second is exactly what you said, which is, yeah, okay, GDP might fall, but let's face it, when GDP was going up, my life was pretty shit. So it doesn't matter. GDP doesn't bother me. And the third is, yep, there will be an economic impact and I'm happy to pay the price. Remember, one of the largest groups of Leave voters were what we call, we did a report on it on our website a few weeks ago, comfortable leavers. These are, you know, well-off conservative voting people in the shires who all said in these focus groups, there might be some disruption, but we're comfortable. We can cope with it. You know, we'll be absolutely fine. So some Leave voters were simply saying, we're willing to pay an economic price to get what we want. The other thing I would add is that for some of those poorer Brexit voters, and actually in terms of regional economics, some of the, essentially there is a team at Birmingham that has done some work on the expected regional distribution of Brexit impacts. And what they found is there's almost a perfect correlation between how strongly a region voted Leave and how exposed its economy is to trade with the European Union. So most people expect that areas that voted Leave will be disproportionately badly hit by the direct trade effects of Brexit. However, if you're one of those people in Wakefield or in Mansfield or wherever, the one transformation you will see, and you will put it down to Brexit rightly or wrongly, is we had a referendum in 2016. Prior to that, the north of England has been subject to 40 years of complete disinterest at best by the British government. All of a sudden we have a referendum, we leave the European Union, and we've had 5 years of Conservative governments that talk about nothing but levelling up the country and investing in the north. So an indirect political impact of the referendum has been to shift the political debate. Inequality between different parts of the European Union is now top of the agenda of all politicians, and the idea pre-referendum, I've just wrote the question down and then I sent it to you, which I didn't mean to do. The idea pre-referendum that you'd have a Conservative government that talked about investing in places that haven't done so well was absolute fantasy. Now all of a sudden it's happening. So it's not wholly irrational for a traditional Labour voter in one of these northern towns to have voted Brexit, to have voted Conservative, and now to be happy because it might well be that their town does see investment it never would have got without the Brexit vote, even though membership of the European Union is utterly unconnected, one way or the other, with what's going on.
Yeah. Thanks. My second question actually speaks a bit to what Amy asked last about differentiated impact across regions in the EU. And maybe before we move towards issues like separation, independence, or etc., there's of course something in between that's happening right now. That's basically the impact of Brexit on devolution more generally. Because we used to have this great situation where we had single market rules basically governing the entire economic market situation all across Great Britain and Northern Ireland, with the devolved administrations filling in parts of those policies that were not decided in London. And now, of course, all of that has fallen apart, and Boris Johnson had to come with an internal market bill for basically safeguarding trade, basically replacing the single market of the EU by a single market of the UK, which contains some elements of Northern Ireland which infuriated people in Brussels and in Northern Ireland alike. My question to you is essentially, did really no one see this coming? that some gap would have to be filled by Westminster there? And what effects on, let's say, the policies of devolution would you forecast as a result of the current situation?
I think one of the lessons we learned because of after the referendum was how profoundly unaware the British state, by which I mean politicians and civil servants, were of the extent to which membership of the European Union had sort of inveigled its way into the sort of plumbing of the British state. There was just a complete unawareness of this fact. I mean, remember, one of the most amazing things I heard was when the Democratic Unionist Party was negotiating its confidence and supply arrangement with Theresa May in June 2017, they never mentioned Brexit and the border. It never occurred to them. So, you know, across the political spectrum and including civil servants, the short answer is no. No one had thought this through. Remember, there was no advanced planning. I remember once going into Parliament, sort of middle of 2017, and going to have a cup of coffee with David Lidington, who was leader of the House of Commons at the time. And in the corner of the grand office you get as leader of the House of Commons, he had this whiteboard with scribbles on it. And I said, oh, what's that? And he said, oh, that's when that's for when we remember another bit of legislation we're going to have to pass to replace stuff that the EU does now, because we keep forgetting things. And this was, you know, this was all hands to the pump sort of panic stations that, you know, at one point they realized, you know, the UK hasn't got laws that enables it to charge tariffs because, you know, there's nothing on the statute book because of EU membership. This was a monstrously complicated undertaking. I think it would be a monstrously complicated undertaking for any member state. I don't think this is a uniquely British thing. What was uniquely British was Northern Ireland. But no, you're absolutely right. There was no conception of what this was mean. Governments in England don't tend to spend that much time thinking about Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland anyway, but you're absolutely right. The devolution settlement was predicated on membership of the single market. Without membership of the single market, you either have to have a new devolution settlement or you have borders. You know, if the Scots decide different agricultural standards to the English, you have to check. But what has happened instead is that the internal market bill has basically stripped powers from the Scots and the Welsh. Northern Ireland's slightly different because of the protocol, because what we have, that bloody camera, what we have is a very extreme form of mutual recognition that basically says anything you can sell in one part of the United Kingdom, you've got to be able to sell anywhere else. Which means, because, you know, one of the problems with the UK and devolution is England is so bleeding big and dominates everything. As soon as you say we're having mutual recognition on that sort of level, whatever the Scots legislate, it doesn't matter, because if something is made in England to different standards, you have by law to be able to sell it in Scotland, which means all you're doing by imposing higher standards in Scotland is placing additional costs on Scottish manufacturers that English manufacturers won't face. So in a sense, the internal market bill has been a power grab. The state of devolution I would describe as parlous at the moment. The relations between the devolved government and Westminster are very, very bad. You've seen a slight rise in increase in support for Welsh independence, actually. I don't know what will happen going forward to the devolution settlement. What I do know is A, I need a new computer, and B, that this is not a government that has much time for the devolution settlement.
Great. I mean, I think this is so interesting I mean, this is often what we assume, right, in a way, but on the other hand, we often assume the political actors are rational, and we have a rational choice kind of framework. And I think many of the things that happen in terms of Brexit, both on the supply side of politics, but also on the demand side of politics, do not really square with that, right? And I think that's very, very interesting. One question I had, and I think because I think this idea of what you said, Brexit isn't over, I think that's very interesting, because I wonder to what extent will the experience of Brexit, or will Brexit be experienced to kind of a greater extent in the future? We keep reading news articles about businesses that can't find proper employees at this point. So I'm wondering, okay, so obviously we're now in the pandemic, but if things will, kind of travel restrictions will relax and all these things, will Brexit be felt more, because we'll see, oh, actually these people are not coming back. We have basically a labor force that is underpowered, and will that affect somehow the experience of people? Say, okay, well, I can't get an appointment at the doctors because there are no nurses, or whatever, right? So well, how do you see that in the next few months?
The honest answer is we genuinely don't know, because we don't know what travel patterns will look like post-pandemic. We don't know whether those large numbers of European citizens that have left the UK during the pandemic will come home or back, or leave home to come back, however you want to put it. what we have at the moment is we have a special immigration scheme for NHS workers that has to date proven incredibly successful. So large numbers of non-European immigrants are coming in to work as nurses and doctors. Whether they stay or not, we'll have to see. They're subjected to all sorts of rubbish here. I mean, the costs of immigration into the UK are sky high. Visa costs, paying NHS charges, even people who come over on a visa to work in the NHS have to pay an NHS surcharge, which has always struck me as ridiculous and unfair. And the reason the charges are so high is it's part of the Home Office's funding stream. The Home Office relies on visa charges to pay its own way. So we don't know whether these people will stay or whether they will go. Bear in mind, when it comes to mobility, we don't know, but the British people have not yet had to confront the impact of the pandemic. So if you're an architect or a lawyer or an academic, okay, you haven't yet been invited to go and work or give a lecture or whatever. I'm not entirely certain as to whether or not, if this thing had happened in person and I'd come over to give a lecture and you were going to give me, 50 euros as an honorarium, whether I've had to get a visa. I mean, we just don't know those things yet. We haven't run into those rules as yet. So, and of course, when people start traveling again, I'm pretty confident that the one prediction I will make about Brexit is that French customs officials are going to have all sorts of fun with British travellers making them wait at the borders, just for the hell of it. So people haven't run into the practicalities, either in terms of the impact on travel or, as I said before, on the impact on imports. We are going to see a difference in imports when the UK government puts checks in place. For some people, it will not be worth their while to export to the United Kingdom anymore. At the moment, we're not there yet. So there will be these trickling Brexit effects that make themselves felt over time. Whether that's enough to change public opinion, it won't be a big bang. I'm suspicious. The other thing that's absolutely crucial to bear in mind is companies are very reluctant to blame Brexit for anything. And they're very reluctant to blame Brexit for anything because they know that if they do that, the government will have an absolute fit with them. And the one thing you have to do in the UK at the moment, especially with the prospect of huge amounts of government spending to get the economy going again post-pandemic, is to keep in with the government. So, it would be different if big companies were saying, actually, we can't do this anymore because of Brexit, but they won't because they've been told by government that they shouldn't. Oh, God, look at that.
All right. Well, I think you really need to get a new camera. Thanks. We have one last question by Gustav Meyerбauer. I'll give him the floor and then we'll close our discussion and move to the award ceremony. Gustav, you should be able to open your microphone now.
Yes. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you well, yeah.
I think I have a question that relates a little bit to what you were saying about sort of strategic ambiguity, perhaps in the Brexit camp. And I was right between different streams and people not really knowing both what is politically feasible and what is attractive, perhaps, to sell. And I was wondering how this might relate to sort of British positioning in terms of world affairs. So whether there's a way to square the circle for Brexit proponents, perhaps for British leadership, between sort of a global Brexit, right, going out there and reconnecting with the Commonwealth or whatever, and the little England type of stream of an isolationist, a sort of island. And whether there's any way, or whether this will just result in sort of empty signifiers of building yachts and driving to China and stuff, or whether there is something that we can say about what this might lead to in terms of, I guess, grand strategy, if you will.
I mean, first and foremost, you're absolutely right. There are inbuilt contradictions within the Leave camp. I mean, some of those are domestic. If you go to the website of the Independent newspaper, I've got a piece in there this week that looks at the contradictions on economic policy and the fact that actually, most Brexiters don't want lower standards, even if they allow us to sign trade deals. So there's an issue there. And on global affairs, you're absolutely right. For some, particularly the sort of political leaders of the Leave movement, this was about global Britain. This was about buccaneering, free trading Britain astride the globe. For many Leave voters, it was about pulling up the drawbridge. It was about, we don't like globalization. We certainly don't want foreigners coming and taking our jobs. We want to be more closed to the world than we were before. So I suppose there's a degree of freedom of maneuver for the Prime Minister because in general, people don't pay attention to foreign policy. the Prime Minister is also very adept at making the right signals on foreign policy. So, you know, I was talking about the social values divide. Cutting foreign development aid, however much the sort of metropolitan elite shrieked about it, went down very, very well with Brexit voters. One of whose demands was we should spend more time worrying about us rather than sending our money abroad, whether that be to developing countries or to Brussels. However, what is interesting about British foreign policy at the moment, there's a slight Janus-faced aspect to Boris Johnson, is that internationally, the British government has set itself up very, very clearly as a liberal defender of the international order and a promoter of human rights. Okay, domestically, we've passed legislation that breaks our international commitments. Internationally, we go around telling people to obey international law. We've acted quite strongly on Hong Kong and on China. I mean, they've offered a route to UK citizenship for 3 million Hong Kongers, which is, you know, a bold step. We've been very public in our criticism of China. We've been very public in imposing Magnitsky sanctions on Russians, on Chinese. So this British government has really come up with a rather robust pro-liberal international order foreign policy rhetoric. We also have come up with a very robust rhetoric on climate change. Now, the big question for me about all of this is whether this is performative or real. Okay, this year is a unique year for British foreign policy. We chaired the Security Council, we're chairing the G7, and we're chairing the COP. 3 opportunities for the Prime Minister to strut on the world stage, where the cameras will be on him, he'll be there with Joe Biden and the others, able to sort of show that he's an international statesman. What I don't know, invite me back in a couple of years and I might, is whether or not this is anything more than empty rhetoric aimed at getting a good headline, or whether it's something the government will show the determination to stick to, even when the cameras have gone. But for the moment, I have been very struck by the degree to which the government has adopted this open, global, liberal, internationalist posture in international affairs, which sort of goes against the rather narrow right-wing populist reputation that the government has at home.
All right. Well, I think that's very interesting, and I think that's also a very, very nice contradiction to end this presentation and to end your talk. So I think we probably will have to ask you to come to Nijmegen next year for the sequel and see how these.
You must be hoping never to hear about Brexit again by now, surely.
Well, I mean, I've certainly really enjoyed it, and thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
And with that, we will move to the award ceremony for the Daniel Heinsius Master Thesis Prize and the Els de Witte PhD Prize. I will give Amy Verdun, the chairperson of the Dutch Political Science Association, the floor. She'll say a few words, then we'll invite Simon Otjes to present the Daniel Heinsius Prize, and Aneta Spirazova for the Els de Witte PhD Prize. So with that, Amy, I'll give you the floor.
Thank you very much, Maurits, and thanks for everybody for being here. I know all those who were at the conference were invited to come, and we also invited more people. And so I just want to take a moment here to maybe introduce ourselves for those of you who don't know the Dutch Political Science Association well. So we have 266 members, although it's hard to count them during COVID-19 times because we have about 1/5 of our members who have not paid up. So if you're one of those, please respond to the emails of our treasurer, Marcel Hanegraaf. It should not be too hard to pay up because, as you know, the conference fees are almost included by your membership. But that's just a very cheeky remark from our Dutch cultural stingy background. Anyway, couldn't help but put that in there. Let me just be more serious and thank in particular our 2 program chairs, Maurits Meijers and André Saslo, for the work on the program. Obviously also the Department of Political Science at the Radboud University Nijmegen, and our colleague Peter van Aalst at the University of Antwerp, who's the chair of the Flemish Political Science Association, for all the work they've done on the conference. We're also delighted that Maurits and André have offered, with support of their department, to do the next one, hopefully physically, finally, at Nijmegen again. So that's just really wonderful that they've been wanting to do this again. I also wanted to thank the jury of the 2 prizes that we will going to be turning to in a moment. So Annette Spencer-Rova of Maastricht University, this is the chair of the Els Witte Prize, Ferdy de Wiel, Wouter van Doren, and Dimokritos Kavadias. And the jury of the Daniel Heinsius Prize has Katja Bietenkopf, Benjamin de Wet, Simon Otjes, Lisanne de Blok, and Reinhard van der Veer as members. So thanks to all of them for putting in their efforts for doing this really important work that particularly our junior colleagues benefit so immensely of. So with that, I'll turn the floor over, Maurits, to you to pass it on to the next person of this ceremony.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, Simon, the floor is yours. We see you very well with a very nice map behind you. Great. Yes, I think without much further ado, we move to the Daniel Heinsius Prize for the winner of the best master thesis of the Low Countries.
So with some apologies to our international audience, I'm going to switch to Dutch because the report was written in Dutch and it makes it easier to tell the story. Dus ik ga nu over in het Nederlands. Met veel plezier mag ik namens de voltallige jury de Daniel Heinsius Prijs indienen. Dit is een prijs van de Nederlandse Kring voor de Wetenschap van Politiek en de Vereniging van Politieke Wetenschappen voor de beste masterscriptie binnen het domein van de politicologie, geschreven door een student of een studenten aan een Nederlandse en Vlaamse universiteit. De scripties worden voorgedragen door de begeleiders en beoordeeld door de jury. De jury bestond dit jaar uit 5 leden. Katja Bielendorf, Therese Koen, Reinhard van der Veer, Benjamin de Vet en mijzelf, Simon Otjes, als voorzitter. De jury werd excellent ondersteund door Emiel van Omeren van de Universiteit Antwerpen. Ik heb begrepen dat hij er vandaag niet bij is, maar ik wou hem toch ook voor het grote publiek in elk geval hartelijk bedanken voor zijn grote inzet. We hebben 20 inzendingen ontvangen en precies 10 hiervan kwamen uit Nederland en 10 hiervan kwamen uit Vlaanderen. 3 universiteiten leverden 4 scripties, het waren Antwerpen, Leuven en Leiden. De scripties tonen de breedte binnen onze discipline. Er zaten politiek-theoretische scripties tussen, studies over bestuur en beleid, media, stemgedrag, de parlementaire arena. Er waren scripties over Nederland en over België, over Turkije en Ierland, Brazilië en Colombia, de Europese Unie en de Verenigde Naties. We hebben een veelheid aan methoden gezien, van experimenten en surveys tot interviews en inhoudsanalyse. Iedere jury zal zeggen dat zij dit jaar een bijzonder zware opdracht hadden, omdat ze zo onder de indruk waren van het niveau van de scripties. En dat is ook dit jaar zeker het geval. Gezien de wereldwijde pandemie is het echt opvallend dat studenten en docenten, gedwongen om te werken vanaf hun slaapkamer, bijzonder goede scripties van een uitermate hoog niveau eigenlijk naar het eindpunt hebben weten te brengen. En dus we zijn daar bijzonder van onder de indruk. De jury heeft alle 20 scripties gelezen en beoordeeld. En we zijn door de shortlist gekomen van 3 scripties. In alfabetische volgorde van auteurs waren dit de scriptie van Melissa Murich, The Gravity of Facebook Posts Influencing Politicians on Social Media, die zij schreef aan de Universiteit Antwerpen. Roel Takkens scriptie CRISPR, A Political View of Human Genetic Modification, die hij schreef bij de Radboud Universiteit Nijmegen. En Sarah Uffing's scriptie Deliberative Mini-Publics and Media Framing, Evidence from the Irish Citizens Assembly, die zij schreef aan de Katholieke Universiteit Leuven. Ieder van deze scripties verdient wat ons betreft een eervolle vermelding. Zoals ik aangaf, het was lastig om tussen de 20 scripties te beslissen, maar ook zeker in de laatste 3 was de jury bijzonder onder de indruk van het niveau van alle 3 de scripties. En hadden ze eigenlijk alle 3 de prijs wel kunnen winnen, maar helaas zijn we gedwongen bijna om één winnaar aan te wijzen. Dus ik begin met alfabetisch de eerste scriptie van Melissa Murich. Die stelt de vraag onder welke voorwaarden boodschappen van kiezers op sociale media de persoonlijke opinie en de perceptie van publieke opinie van Vlaamse politici beïnvloeden. De scriptie was zeer goed geschreven en biedt een helder eigen bijdrage aan het debat over de responsiviteit van politici. De meest opmerkelijke presentatie van deze scriptie is het survey-experiment onder lokale politici dat Murich zelf heeft uitgevoerd. Met bijzondere toewijding heeft Murich veel lokale Vlaamse politici weten te overtuigen om deel te nemen aan onderzoek. Ze kregen een responsrate waar veel studies van politieke elites slechts van kunnen dromen. En opnieuw, dat was in een tijd van corona. Dus in de tijd van een pandemie heeft ze heel veel politici toch weten te overtuigen haar survey in te vullen. Dit leidde tot een zeer lezenswaardige analyse van hoe politici reageren op de berichten van kiezers. Roel Takkens' scriptie stelt de politiek-theoretische vraag in hoeverre en op welke normatieve basis het is toegestaan om het werken van het menselijk genoom te verbieden. Deze scriptie neemt ons aan de hand door de evolutiebiologie via de ethiek van Aristoteles naar het huidige politieke debat. Het neemt een groot aantal politiek-filosofische perspectieven mee in de analyse. De scriptie is zeer goed geschreven en zou niet meer staan in de populair wetenschappelijke hoek van de betere boekenwinkel. Het biedt een heldere, praktische en overtuigende normatieve analyse over de voorwaarden waar we genetische modificatie aan zouden moeten binden. Sarah Uffing's scriptie stelt de vraag hoe deliberatief democratische initiatieven de manier waarop media verslag doen van klimaatverandering beïnvloeden. Deze zeer relevante studie kijkt als een van de eerste studies naar de relatie tussen aan de ene kant democratische innovatie en aan de andere kant de verslaglegging door de traditionele media. Hiermee geeft de scriptie een hele duidelijke theoretische innovatie aan het veld. De scriptie bovendien heeft ook een heel grote eigen dataverzameling en baseert zich eigenlijk op 2 verschillende datasets en presenteert dit in een samenhangend geheel. Nou, zoals ik al zei, gezien de hoge kwaliteit van de scripties en ook duidelijk de verschillende sterktes en de verschillende benaderingen, was het voor de jury lastig om 1 winnaar uit te kiezen. Na ampel beraad heeft de jury gekozen voor de scriptie van Melissa Muric, die met name opvalt door de bijzondere toewijding van de student aan het onderzoek. Wij feliciteren Melissa met haar prestatie en ook proficiat aan de supervisor Julie Zevenand.
Okay, with that, I just want to invite Melissa to forward, basically. So she will be joining us from the panelists, as a panelist here. Yeah, Melissa, congratulations.
Yes, thank you. I also had problems with my camera. I also want to thank the jury and, of course, my master thesis promoter, Julie, for her very valuable support throughout the research project. And as was mentioned previously, we assume that politicians are very rational, but I think the world has changed and is changing. And I think that we need to be critical about this, and we need to explore whether they really are not influenced by anything at all. Are they really not susceptible to influence? And we have social media, we have other parties on social media, we have citizens on social media, and this is what I try to do with my thesis, and I hope I can inspire others to also venue into this topic and research this, because I had a lot of fun with researching this topic, and I think it's something very important to investigate.
Okay, well, congratulations again. Really, really well done. Yeah, I think I think it's amazing. I think it's an amazing topic, and I think it's great to see yeah, this kind of innovative approach from the new guard. So I think the kids are all right, so to speak. So with that, we will move to the Els de Witte PhD prize. Simon, thanks so much for coming forward, so to speak. And Melissa, congratulations again. I hope you can celebrate well. Great. I'm just going to do some clicking here, so bear with me. Let me see. All right. Apologies. So I'm just going to ask Aneta to be joining us as a panelist. There she is. Great. Hi, welcome. Good afternoon, Aneta.
Hi, good afternoon. It's lovely to join. Perhaps without further ado, shall I announce the Els Witte PhD prize winner for this year, Maurits?
Please do so. Yeah, thanks.
Fantastic. So it's a pleasure to join you and also to share the winner of the Els Witte PhD dissertation prize. Indeed, just to echo Simon's comments, it was quite tough to come up with one winner. We had 12 nominated dissertations written in Dutch or Flemish universities of really outstanding quality this year. And the members of the selection committee, Wouter van Doren from the University of Antwerp, Hortense Jongen from the Free University Amsterdam, Dimo Cavadias from the Free University Brussels, myself chairing the committee, Aneta Spenjarova from Maastricht University, and Ferry de Ville from Ghent University, had quite a lively deliberation, as I'm going to share with you in a moment, to indeed decide on one single winner, which was a difficult endeavor. After a careful assessment of all nominated PhD theses, 12 this year, the committee members shortlisted 4 dissertations, which stood out with the originality and rigor of the theoretical, empirical, and methodological aspects of the nominees' work. These theses are Carola Schor's thesis. She wrote her dissertation in Maastricht University. The dissertation is on the politics of style, political performance caught between populism, elitism, and pluralism. Hannah Werner from the University of Amsterdam for her dissertation, Pragmatic Citizens, a Bottom-up Perspective on Participatory Politics. Thomas Jacobs from Ghent University for his dissertation, Winning Hegemony, a Discourse Theoretical Perspective on Political Strategy and the Trade Politics of the European Parliament. And Wouters Hakel from the University of Amsterdam for his dissertation, Representing the Rich, Economic and Political Inequality in Established Democracies. So as you see, these 4 shortlisted dissertations span the important topics of the day, but looking at them from a very rigorous theoretical and empirical perspective, all 4 really represent outstanding work done by recently defended PhD dissertations in Dutch or Flemish universities. And in the final deliberation of the committee, 2 dissertations really impressed the members with their conceptually bold and innovative theoretical approaches, as well as the empirical richness and scope of the conducted research. These were the dissertations of Carola Schor and Thomas Jacobs. I would like to say a few words about each of these dissertations. As I mentioned in our final deliberation, they led to a very lively discussion, and it was really hard indeed, again to Iko Simon, to pick one winner of the PhD dissertation prize this year. So let me start with Carola Schor's dissertation. It takes a novel, original approach to studying populism, focusing on political style and populist political rhetoric. This thesis impressed the committee with its intellectual and conceptual creativity, drawing on political communication, political science, and political theory. Carola has crafted a very promising new tool for analyzing political discourse, what she calls the PEP index, and that stands for Populism, Elitism, Pluralism Index. Indeed, very original conceptual contribution that she then applies empirically in her thesis. Furthermore, Carola's dissertation impressed the jury with her convincing conceptualizations of political style, populism, political metaphor, blending them all together in a very clearly written writing style. And this allows her in the end to uncover the underlying structure of populist political discourses. Last but not least, Carola's accomplished and clear writing style makes her dissertation a real pleasure to read. After a lively deliberation, still the committee members decided to award the Els Witte Dissertation Prize in 2021 to Thomas Jacobs from Ghent University. Congratulations, Thomas. Thomas' dissertation really impressed the committee members, again, with its very innovative, very original theoretical approach developed to study political strategy, drawing on and contributing to post-structuralist discourse theory. We saw that Thomas makes several important methodological and empirical contributions. In a very well-crafted research design, he uses a quantitative methodology, topic modeling, for studying systematically the European Parliament's political discourse in EU trade policy. Both the quantitative methodology and also the substantive policy area that he discusses are challenges enough, and he blends them together in a very, very convincing and well-crafted research design. The analytical approach, furthermore, is rooted in critical political economy, which Thomas managed to make very accessible to mainstream political scientists through his clear writing style, precise and detailed operationalization, and a very carefully conducted empirical analysis. Furthermore, Thomas used open access data for his study, fully accessible for replication, which we also thought was a best practice methodologically. So I would like to extend my heartfelt congratulations to all 4 shortlisted candidates for their really outstanding work, and also heartfelt congratulations to this year's winner of the Els Witte PhD Dissertation Prize, Thomas Jacobs.
All right, congratulations, Thomas, also from me. Do you want to say a few words?
Anita and Maurits, thank you so much, and to all jury members, of course. I'm really happy right now. I started my PhD 4 years ago, and the very first conference I attended was actually Politicologenetmaal, and I met a colleague there, Robin Churchill, and based on our conversation, the whole methodology that was the basis of my PhD was developed. So in a way, it feels really great to be here at the end again. You know, it feels like very full circle. It's also really great to hear that there were so many great theses on discourse, like Carola's coursework on discourse. I really like it. So it's great to hear that, you know, discourse analytic research is on the rise in the Low Countries. So I'm very happy. I want to thank my supervisors, Jan and Ferdi and Christophe, my colleagues, Niels, who might be here, and of course the other people at the Center of EU Studies at Ghent University. And most of all, I want to say thank you for rewarding 4 years of 4 years that were in themselves really rewarding, and I had a fantastic time for 4 years, and I don't know, it feels good to be here at the end. So thank you.
Well, yeah, well, thanks and congratulations once more. So I think, yeah, Belgium, or at least Flanders, really won this time with both the master thesis and the PhD thesis. So next week the Euros are starting, and I don't think I don't have the biggest confidence in the Dutch squad, but maybe we'll have to do some payback in one way or another. No, just kidding aside. Thanks so much, everybody, for joining. Thanks, Annette, for presenting this, and yeah, congratulations again to Thomas and Melissa. So this video will also be uploaded to our YouTube page, and yeah, we are really excited and now also increasingly confident that we can have you and invite you to Nijmegen next year to show you our beautiful campus, and we really hope and to meet you there physically in person with a drink in hand. So to that, let's hope for that, and see you soon, speak soon, and stay safe and be well. Bye bye.